Welcome to Research Tool and Instrumentation. So after this session, you'll be able to identify appropriate tools for a research study, discuss the validity and reliability of research instruments, and also you'll be able to identify the different types of research tools used in unpublished and published research studies. So for instrumentation and data gathering, for both quantitative and qualitative data, I suggest I think, rather, that at this point in the lecture series, that you already have a clear difference or probably a better understanding of the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. So given their difference, would there be a difference as well with what instruments can be used for qualitative only and quantitative only, and how data is gathered if you're using a quantitative approach or qualitative approach? Would you think that there would be a difference as well? So let's find out. So first, what is data gathering? According to Almeida, Gerlon, and Manley in 2016, data gathering is an essential process in research as it is through that gathered data that the problems identified in the study are answered. So simply put, data gathering is when you try to collect information from the external world. So you gather data, let's just say you collect photos, you collect results, you give out the surveys. So those are forms of data gathering or examples of data gathering. So it is essential in research because without data, you don't have anything to analyze. You can't draw conclusions out of thin air. That wouldn't be research, right? So why are tools then important? So appropriate tools and techniques have to be used in gathering the information needed to come up with valid and reliable information. So we can relate this with our kinesiology, or let's just say MMT and ROM. So we need the valid and reliable tools, or the appropriate tools. Let's say you cannot measure range of motion of a particular joint without a goniometer. You cannot measure range of motion, for example, for elbow flexion by just using a ruler. That wouldn't be an appropriate tool. The same goes for research. So what are the different approaches to data gathering? So we have either primary data or secondary data. So from the word primary, it's from you. I mean, you gathered it yourself. So primary sources through observation by you, interview process or questionnaires gathered by the researcher. Secondary data are secondary sources. This can be taken through census, reports, or personal records. So can you remember your first experience handling clients in your fieldwork? So you went over their personal records to know more about them. So that is an example of gathering secondary data. So can you think of instances wherein you tried to gather primary data when you did your fieldwork, and other instances where you tried to gather secondary data? Can you clearly see the difference between the two? So for primary data. So primary data, as was mentioned, involves either observations, interviews, or the use of questionnaires. So for observation, there are two types. So first, before proceeding to the two types, what is observation? So according to Kumar in 2011, observation is a, take note, purposeful, systematic, and selective way of watching and listening to an interaction or phenomenon as it takes place. So in many situations, observation is a very appropriate method of data collection, especially when respondents are not cooperative or are unaware of the answer, as they could not detach themselves from the interaction. So what does it mean? In short, when the researcher is more interested in the behavior rather than the perceptions of individuals, then observation is the best approach to collect the required information. So there are two types of observation. We have participant observation and non-participant observation. So when we say participant observation, the researcher participates in the activities of the group being observed. So for example, there is a group activity, you're part of the group activity or the group dynamics, and you're also observing while participating in the activity. Whereas number two, non-participant observation, you're just a passive observer. You watch from the sides. The next one is interview. We have unstructured interview and structured interview. From the words unstructured and structured, the difference is the flow, or let's just say the guide. So in an unstructured interview, the researcher has complete freedom to use the words, content, and structure of the interview. So it's more or less free flow. So if you want to ask about a particular thing at first, and then you heard the client say something related to topic B, then you go there. So the researcher more or less guides the direction. Whereas in a structured interview, there are, take note, predetermined set of questions as specified in the interview schedule. So when we say interview schedule, this is the list of questions that you asked during an interview. So compared to an unstructured interview, the structured interview has this characteristic of uniform information for comparability of data. So you can compare the answers of your clients or your participants based on the questions you asked. So what is the difference or similarities of the participants' responses in relation to question number one, question number two, so on and so forth. The next one is a questionnaire. So from the word questionnaire, it is a written list of questions intended to provide answers to the problems of the study. A very common questionnaire or form of questionnaire is a survey. So have you done or have you experienced handing out surveys? How was it? And how was the survey conducted? Commonly, respondents read and interpret what are expected in the questions. So have you heard about self-reported questionnaires? So that is one example. So again, for primary data, we have observation, interviews, and questionnaires. So the next one is secondary data. So where can we get secondary data? I think this was more or less touched in the previous lectures. So examples where you can get secondary data are demographic information, census, surveys on labor force, health reports, and economic forecasts. All of these are usually government publications. There are also previews of researches done by others. So you can get data from other published studies. This can also be taken from personal and historical records and other published reports in newspapers, magazine, or even in the internet. So we talked about using the appropriate tools in conducting research. An example we gave out a while ago was the use of goniometers in measuring range of motion. It would be entirely stupid to measure the range of motion for elbow flexion using a ruler. How would that be? So for us to be able to make a successful research, to gather appropriate, valid, and reliable data, we use appropriate tools. You might have heard the term reliability and validity. So when we speak of reliability, this is the consistency, stability, and dependability of the data. When we say consistency, no matter how many times you took or you measured something using that particular tool, it would come out as the same. If I measured this one 5 minutes ago and measured it 10 minutes later, it would still be the same. When we speak of validity, this is the extent to which a measurement does what it is supposed to do. So it measures what it intends to measure. So by looking at a goniometer, for example, you can tell that it measures degrees or range of motion. By looking at a meter stick or ruler, you can tell that it measures length. By looking at the set of questions in a particular questionnaire, you can really tell what it is supposed to measure. For example, your BDI, based on the contents, what does it measure? So for reliability and validity, you will be having a separate group work for this one to know more about the different types of reliability and validity. So for example, you might have heard about intra-rater reliability and inter-rater reliability. And for validity, you might have heard face validity and content validity. Another way to make sure that our tools are appropriate is you have consultation with experts. So this ensures that theoretical constructs directly related to the major concepts of the study are fully established. So it means that your tool, upon review with experts, is a valid tool for data collection. So if you want to ask someone about child psychology, you made your own tool, you consult with an expert in child psychology to make sure that your tool is valid. So you also have pre-testing. If you make your own tool that is on another expert level, so you pre-test the tool. This is pre-testing is using the tool on individuals who resembles the characteristics of the intended population of the study, not the actual population. So if your population are birthing centers located in Cebu City and you want to pre-test your tools, then you pre-test your tool in birthing centers located in Mandawi City. So what is the importance of pre-testing? It determines the language suitability and the comprehensibility of the items. Because at times, when you try to make up a questionnaire, for you it might be very understandable or comprehensible since you are the one making. But when you try to turn it over to the participants, or let's just say to the students if you're trying to make questions, it might lead to a different thing. So that's why you need pre-testing. For item analysis, this is done after pre-testing. So after you've tried to distribute or use your researcher-made questionnaire on a population similar to your study, your questionnaire is then scored and subjected to a test of reliability. So how are the items reliable, the items in your questionnaire? So it is subjected to statistical analysis by the use of Cronbach's alpha. So this is the correlation coefficient. So are the items in your questionnaire, are the contents more or less correlated? For it to be acceptable, the Cronbach's alpha should be 0.70 or higher. So if it is lower than 0.70, then you have to revise or revisit the contents of your questionnaire.